Welcome back, everyone. Today, as promised, we're going to be talking about 3 gens and how to break them. But before we get into it, now, contrary to popular opinion, I do want to preface this whole thing. The Skull Merchant's power was not only good for 3genning. What people saw was a culmination of content creators who didn't bother learning how to use her power, defaulting to 3gens and then saying, "Aha! Her power must be meant for this!" Here's a little secret. That was actually the weakest possible way to play her. The thing is, on release, the Skull Merchant's power is a passive power, meaning that her power doesn't specifically do anything for you like Blight or Wesker's power, but is more akin to Pig's power, in that the threat of her power causes survivors to delay themselves or otherwise waste time. Now, why is this important to understand? Well, the more one understands how 3genning happens and how to beat it, the more people will understand that Skull Merchant was nerfed over quite literally nothing. It only takes survivors playing intelligently and with patience to beat her if she holds a 3gen. So yes, Skull Merchant quite literally got the Freddy treatment, and that she was nerfed because she wasn't a killer that survivors could easily play the one strategy of forcing her to take bad chases for their own amusement, like they do with literally every other killer besides Nurse, Blight, or Wesker. That's right, all of the complaints about the Skull Merchant 3gen was a whole lot of crying over nothing. Literally, survivors crying, "You need to nerf your killer because I don't understand how to play your game." Now that we have that out of the way, some facts about 3gens and how to beat them. First and foremost, the dirty secret about 3genning is that every map has multiple 3gens deliberately baked into them. That's right, the devs fully intended Killer to force survivors into a 3gen situation on every single map. In fact, most maps have multiple 3gens available to them, some stronger than others, and many of them leading into other 3gens. But I mean, who are we to expect survivors to actually pay attention to their surroundings? Am I right? If it isn't fed to them over comms, then it seems it doesn't exist. Second, in dev streams, Matt Cote was recorded instructing killers to 3gen survivors when asked about killers getting meaningful gen defense. Killers must accept losing gens early and fast, so, and I quote, "pick a few gens and guard them." The thing is, these deliberate 3gen strategies were the dev's own solution for how powerful Survive with Friends is when compared to Killer. Having 3gens in a tight area to guard does significantly hamper a Swift's ability to steamroll a killer. Unfortunately, this is merely a band-aid fix, and not even a good one at that, since a Swift can, and easily does, overcome a 3gen, even against pre-nerf Skull Merchant using Overcharge and Call of Brine. Third, most 3gen situations are the fault of survivor impatience. Quite literally, survivors rushing to slam out gens along with their Swift so they too can have those 4-minute matches like their favorite comp team does, except against an unsuspecting killer in public matches who's not playing like it's a tournament. Yes, that's right, survivors are the one most often 3genning themselves, because for them the goal is speed and efficiency, not planning and strategy. Now, it might be at this point you are wondering why I keep bringing up the Skull Merchant. Well, this is the very reason why. Skull Merchant changed the way survivors had to play around the map, as any good killer does. Gone were the days of diving in and slamming out gens before Killer could begin to play, so survivors and their team could enjoy a friendly round of just animations at the gate as they somehow earned it through sheer skill. Nope, now survivors would be required to think and plan ahead in order to escape. But since using their brain meats proved to be too much for survivor mains, Killer is the one that needed to be nerfed, and of course so did the perks that they were using along with them. If more survivors actually understood how to play Dead by Daylight well, this never would have been an issue pre-patch 6.7. All three of these points show that the issue is caused because some survivors have a lack of game development awareness, map awareness, and self-awareness when it comes to Dead by Daylight. Finally, before we get to how to break a 3gen, the Call of Brine and Overcharge combination was never a problem. Choy did a fantastic job proving this in a video he made last April, linked in the description below. And if you don't believe me that Call of Brine and Overcharge combo was not a problem, watch the video. Watch it! After watching that video, it's very, very clear that Call of Brine and Overcharge are not a problem. Well, at least they were not a problem. The reason survivors have a problem with these perks is because they are not doing generators. That's correct. If your team is pressuring generators with some regularity, these perks are not a problem. The thing is, a Swift isn't even necessary to achieve this, nor is gen rushing. You just do gens. That's how you escape. You just do gens. What tends to hurt most teams is getting a duo who is dedicated only to bullying a killer or trying to force whatever new meme tech they saw on YouTube. So whenever a killer comes to trial, ready to play a match, even if they aren't being super sweaty, your team is going to suffer because Wingus and Dingus over there are going down and suiciding on hook because their flashlight bully failed. If any of this at all is ringing a bell, I hope it better helps everyone who cried over these two perks to realize you are blaming the killer for the failures of your team. And you complained and asked the devs to make the killer roll harder so that Tweedledee and Tweedledummer don't affect your ability to win. If you need Dead by Daylight to be made that easy for you as Survivor, I've got some bad news for you. So now that pesky, cold, harsh reality is out of the way, as well as that haunting introspection, that soul-crushing weight nagging at your essence, telling you that maybe you aren't as good of a survivor as you think you are, now it's time to correct that and teach you how to break a 3-gen. The first step to combating a 3-gen happens before trial even begins. It starts with understanding the first 2 points that I had made earlier to come to a place of awareness, both map awareness and game sense. This is the most important step to beating a 3-gen. By understanding where generators are positioned around a map, survivors can make more informed decisions on which generators to work on and which ones not to. Take, for example, the Groaning Storehouse. On this map, there are 2 long corridors running away from the center of the map that usually have a generator at the far-flung end of it, or somewhere closer to the center of the map, usually about halfway down that corridor. When you start the trial, if you are near any of these specific generators, leave them alone. Completing these gens pushes all generators closer towards a centralized position. Sure, completing these generators will create a strategic dead zone against the killer, but that dead zone essentially already existed, so your actions will be redundant. And the reason for this is because most killers know to just leave those generators alone. Let them go. They're bad for killing. Now remember that third point I made about impatience among survivors? Well, here's where that comes into play. After loading into a trial, instead of jumping on the first generator you see, explore the map a little bit. Because of the random nature of each map, knowing what potential 3-gen setups exist can help you and your team in avoiding 3-genning themselves by slamming out the wrong generators, impatiently. The perk Deja Vu is an excellent perk for helping newer survivors identify the best generators to focus on. Of course, this won't be necessary in all situations, as with more experience, you'll start to understand which generators are okay to do right away from the beginning and which ones aren't. But for those who are not all that familiar with maps, and even if you are familiar with maps, it's still a good tip. Just take some time and try to figure out where your generators are and where your 3-gens are. So theoretically, and bear in mind, I say theoretically because every map is different and has different RNG. But theoretically, what generators should survivors focus on first in order to avoid being 3-gen'd? Well, those would be the generators closest to the center of the map. Keep in mind, the center of the map should be dictated by the generator placement in addition to the physical map space, so not just the map geography alone. By factoring generator placement into identifying where the center of the map is, survivors can more easily determine the balance of the map and thus which generators to prioritize first. As a rule, survivors should focus on these centermost gens first, since they typically chain into other 3-gens if left alone. That said, be sure to check if the gen you are working on can chain into another 3-gen. If for some reason it can't, then consider ignoring it. The goal should always be to split the gens as much as possible. This might make Killer more relentless in chase, because they don't have any good generators to guard, but it does ensure that your team does have enough time to finish the remaining generators with little opposition. As a general rule, survivors should prioritize generators in this order: gens part of an existing 3-gen, unsafe generators, and generators near basement. Gens part of an existing 3-gen is pretty self-explanatory, especially in a video about how to overcome a 3-gen. Unsafe generators is a bit more vague, and for those who don't understand what that means, an unsafe generator is any generator without immediate access to a safe pallet or window. The reason it's vital to target these generators is because of that very lack of windows and pallets. It makes it even easier for the killer to defend these generators or down a survivor, especially in the event of a 3-gen. Finally, the generator closest to the basement, not shack, specifically the basement, is a high priority because if a survivor is hooked in the basement while the basement gen is part of a 3-gen, you've basically lost if your team is unable to slam out the last gens before the hooked survivor dies. If the killer controls a 3-gen around the basement, the killer has no reason to leave, and instead of defending gens, now the killer's top priority is to ensure a crucial kill that can make breaking a 3-gen virtually impossible. With that information in mind, what then do solo survivors do in the event that a killer is trying to force a 3-gen in the early game? Well, that's fairly easy. In theory, at least. You need a team who's not made up of a bunch of yahoos going for the next big bully montage to be able to pull this off. But let's assume that your team is not memeing for likes. In this case, what you need to do is consider the weight of the gens. If the killer is guarding the heaviest or top priority gens, focused on the next heaviest gens, the ones in the immediate surrounding area of the 3-gen. By isolating this 3-gen, the killer becomes unable to recover their position once that 3-gen is broken. Next, get the furthest generators to 99% completion. The more, the better. If a team has 3 generators remaining, for the sake of argument, and they isolate a guarded 3-gen and then 99 the rest of the gen, the killer loses before they realize what pressure they are really under once that 3-gen is broken. 99ing gens is a very powerful tool that is often used by Swifts to counter early 3-gens and even hard counter Pig's power. By not fully finishing generators, the killer is pressured to leave their 3-gen to make sure that survivors aren't cornering the killer. This leaves their 3-gen vulnerable, even if just for a few seconds. In that time, survivors can make considerable progress compared to gen regression speeds. The thing to remember is this: in the war of attrition, survivors always win, so long as all 4 survivors remain alive. The next thing solo survivors need to learn is how to ping-pong gens. This is something Swifts do very often, and with high success. Although comms makes the strategy unbelievably powerful, simply paying attention to your surroundings will still be considerably strong when ping-ponging gens. To do this, all that is needed is for 2 survivors to jump on one generator at the furthest end of a 3-gen, and for the other 2 to jump on the other gen at the opposite end. While you're working on the generators, if you see or hear the killer coming at all, run away from the generator a little ways. Ideally, you want to be close enough to the generator to see if the killer has kicked it and or leaves it, but far enough that starting a chase with you would signal a loss for the killer. Don't stay on a generator long enough for a killer to hit you unless you are intending to go down finishing the generator. Allowing yourself to get hit wastes more time for your team, either because you're healing or you ended up on a hook for being dumb. Of course, this has all been made much easier with a recent HUD buff to survivors. When dealing with a 3-gen, if you see 2 survivors working on a generator, you know where the killer is not, something that is just as important as knowing where the killer is. This is how ping-ponging works. The moment you hear the killer coming in your direction, leave that generator and wait for the killer to leave for the other generator. This strategy keeps the killer bouncing back and forth between generators without giving them an opportunity to get someone on the hook. Eventually, either the survivors or the killer is going to break and get impatient, and the first one to break loses. Sadly, the ones often breaking first are survivors. They didn't want a match where they had to use strategy or play against a killer who might be on equal footing with them. They just wanted the killer to take bad chases and feed them those sweet YouTube clips. The worst part about this happening is that if survivors just stayed the course, bouncing on and off generators, the survivors would eventually win by default. Yes, most often it's survivors self-sabotaging or just throwing that causes most teams to lose in a 3-gen situation. The other dirty little secret about a 3-gen is that literally any killer can do it, and most more effectively than pre-nerf Skull Merchant. The other side to this secret, however, is that it's actually a very weak position for killers to hold, since it places them in a completely defensive situation, one where the clock is actively against them. So yeah, for every survivor complaining about a killer or a perk holding you at a 3-gen, you only have yourself or your team to blame. Of course, it's easier to point fingers instead of recognizing your or your teammates' failures in getting into a 3-gen situation to begin with, which is exactly what the survivor side of the Dead by Daylight community does. Most effective technique, really. Instead of growing and learning, becoming better and more skilled players, they just cried the devs, making the other role even harder to play because their precious hands haven't been held enough. There is a reason why the Dead by Daylight survivor side of the community is seen as incredibly entitled by other gaming circles. There's also a reason why it's so easy for low-skill survivors to consistently win while high-skill killers struggle against low-skill survivors. By constantly complaining, survivors generally rely on mechanics being so favorable to them that they can be put into a state of autopilot and never have to think about the short or the long game in each trial. Although behavior and the community might think they're doing right by survivors, the reality is they are not doing survivors any favors by coddling them and protecting them from real killer strategies. The result is that many killers feel the only viable options they have left is resorting to camping, tunneling, slugging, and finally the 3-gen if generators are completed too quickly. So, now that you know the facts about a 3-gen and how to break them, and the effects of survivors blaming killers and killer perks for their own self-sabotage or for their teammates trolling around in a trial, I leave you with some final tips. Brand new parts are powerful tools when used early, but did you know that they are significant tools for breaking a 3-gen? Next time you use a brand new part, use it to finish a generator instead of starting it. Doing this will allow survivors to more effectively finish key generators before killer can stop them, effectively breaking or preventing a 3-gen scenario. Vittorio's perk Potential Energy is also another tool effective for busting a 3-gen. The best way to effectively use this perk is to use another generator to build up charges, then run to a generator that is part of the 3-gen and dump your charges into that gen for an instant 20 seconds of gen time. Do this enough and you'll easily slam out a guarded gen. The secret is in the math. After 10 seconds of working on a generator, a survivor can build up to 20 seconds of instant gen time to use wherever they want. After dumping those charges into a target gen, even if the killer kicks, without any perks of course, the generator, a killer will only regress about 10 seconds of the total time that it takes to fully charge another round of potential energy. That is a positive 10 seconds every single time you come back to that generator. Finally, the important thing to know is that this really, of course, only works when 4 survivors are alive. If a killer has a 3-gen and 1 survivor is dead, the chances of getting out of there are slim to none. In this situation, both the killer and the survivors are at a stalemate, which does happen in games, and frankly, it's something that survivors need to accept can and does happen. Stalemates are a thing. If the killer leaves the gens, they lose, and if the survivors are caught at the gens, the survivors lose. This is not something that is the fault of any particular killer, it's just a simple issue of the map design and some intentional game mechanics. If you find yourself in this situation, the thing to keep in mind is this. The first side to make a move is the one that's most likely to lose. All you can do is attack the gens and bounce off of them as quickly as possible, staying as safe as possible, until either another survivor is caught or the killer commits to a bad chase. That's the only way you're going to win with less than 4 players. Other than that, If you're at a 3-gen and you have less than 4 players, I mean, it's just good game at that point. Not much you can do about it, and that's just the reality of it. Anyways, that's going to do it for me. I want to thank everyone so much for watching this video. I hope you all found it fun and informative, and for some killers out there, I hope you all found it refreshing to kind of just hear those things that honestly need to be said about the survivor side in this game. And for you survivors who are listening to this, if you were offended or upset by this in any way, you need to reconsider the way you play and how much you really understand about the game. Because if you had known these things, if most survivors knew these things or were aware of these proper game mechanics or how to work gens, killers like Skull Merchant wouldn't have been nerfed. Perks like Call of Brine and Overcharge would not have been nerfed. I mean, those two in particular are a good, actually, all three of those are a very, very, very clear example of survivors literally complaining about nothing. It's much ado about nothing, and then these the killer and these perks get nerfed because survivors basically don't want to learn how to play. It's an unfortunate reality, but it's been something that's been going on with Dead by Daylight for about 7 years now. It's no surprise to any veteran who's been around the game long enough. But anyways, that's going to do it for me. I hope you guys found this informative. I hope you all found it entertaining. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'm going to see all of you guys in the next video, or at least in the fog on my Friday night Dead by Daylight. And if you want to see more Dead by Daylight gameplay, because I understand there's a fair amount of content creators who are whining about their precious E button getting nerfed, leaving the game, let me know. I'll do more games, and I'll try to do more streams in the during the day or at night on my channel over on Twitch. I'm prattling on, but that's probably the pain medication kicking in. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.